All right. So well, first of all, it's a privilege to have you with us, Mr. Jeff Krivis. Why don't you are one of the best mediators we know here in LA and certainly in California and perhaps in the US. Tell us a little bit about your background, what kind of cases you handle, and if you may, something that is critical about your past, if you would like to share. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor Singh. I'm delighted to be here. Well, let me start from the beginning. I've been a lawyer for 40 years, started in 1980, and I was a trial lawyer for the first 10 years of my practice. Courtroom battles, that's what I did. And in 1989, I had a big corporate client out of Texas that wanted me to settle some cases and asked me to mediate the cases. And back then, we didn't have a real field of mediators. There were a couple to choose from. And the only one that was really kind of had a high status was Warren Knight. And I didn't really want to go to Warren Knight. I'd been to him before. He was the hammer, you were the nail. I said to the client, maybe there's somebody else. And by the way, little did I know, Warren Knight became the godfather of mediation. So the client sent out a mediator from Texas who had been trained and certified in Texas mediation. And he did a really good job. And I ended up having dinner with him after the cases. And I asked him if he got paid for this kind of thing. And he said, yeah, this is a business in Texas. Come join us and learn how to do this. And so in the summer of 1989, right in the middle of my litigation practice, I joined this group in Texas, in Dallas, and studied how to become a mediator. I became a certified Texas mediator and got the bug for it. As you can imagine, I am a curious person. I am always open to ideas. I'm entrepreneurial, and my entire life I've been sort of a builder. And when I got this mediation bug, I came back and said to my law partner, I'm going to do this. And I looked around, and there were only a handful of people actually interested in it and doing it. And one happened to be Randy Lowry at Pepperdine. And Randy was doing the first ever Southern California Mediation Association conference at Pepperdine that year. So timing seemed to be right, and it seemed like there was some interest. And so I plugged into that, to the flow of it, and really was inspired by the idea of building something new. And it was just, fortuitous that it had to do with the legal community at the time. It could have been anything. I'm, again, curious and interested in an entrepreneur. And so I was able to really plug into my unique ability, which was in problem solving, in managing conflict. I mean, I knew that I could do some of that as a lawyer, but not in the role of a neutral, somebody who would manage the entire process. And, fortunately, over the years, my cases have been just varied. I didn't start in one area of law, and I didn't stay with it. Nowadays, everybody's specialized in, whether it's intellectual property or employment discrimination or wage and hour, they mainly stay in their lane. I started out as a pure neutral and ended up getting all kinds of cases, ranging from, garden variety tort cases to, well, being in LA, many, many celebrity entertainment cases. Worked in the area of life, health, and disability in the 90s, insurance bad faith, insurance coverage. In the last 15, 20 years, I've done quite a few class actions in the wage and hour area. And of course, just recently, concluded a major sexual abuse case. I've done a lot of sexual abuse in the last couple of years, and that's kind of reflective of the change in society that's going on, the correction in society. And I've been there to kind of do the cases as society moves in different directions, and it's been pretty exciting. I remember after Clarence Thomas became a Supreme Court justice, all of a sudden we had an influx of sexual harassment cases in the 90s. Got to do a lot of those, then that slowed down. And depends on what's happening in society. And I've been able to glom onto the various areas of law. So it's been just a incredible run for the last 30 years. And one of the really valuable things in my experience was really kind of connecting up with Pepperdine. At the time, it was called just the Institute for Dispute Resolution. And then Leonard Strauss gave a charitable donation, and they changed the name, I think in the early 90s, to the Strauss Institute. And, Randy Lowry and I were doing some kind of a workshop for a bunch of judges, trying to teach people the difference between mediation and meditation. And he recruited me and invited me to teach. And I had never taught before. And so I had to observe him and Peter Robinson, the two greatest professors I've ever seen. You can imagine how intimidating it might have been to watch them work and then have to perform after them and be entertaining and dramatic and tell stories. And I learned a lot from them. They were my mentors, and that got me launched.
That is such an amazing story. Thank you for sharing. And I am delighted that you're part of Pepperdine, that you're part of Strauss Institute from the very beginning, from Randy Lowry and Peter Robinson's time. So I'm so excited for getting to learn more about you and your mediation practice. So quick question. Allow me to, and thank you for sharing the background and the cases, which sounds like a wide variety, almost anything under earth, which is complex and difficult, you can mediate. And I love the word you use, curious, that you were curious from the beginning. You were willing to challenge yourself. And allow me to ask you, what has been the most rewarding mediation experience for you and why, please?
Yes, at first blush, one would say, well, what case have you worked on that's the most rewarding? And it's really, there's been so many cases, and the cases are just one component of it. It's this idea of lifelong learning that my soul was opened up to in 1989. As a litigator, as a trial lawyer, I had a very narrow focus, and my world was the lane I was in, the legal cases I was handling, the daily law journals that I was reading. But when I was exposed to this area of mediation, all of a sudden I was able to start studying the social sciences, the areas of not just law, but neuroscience and psychodrama and psychology and decision-making and the art of persuasion and influence. And it really gave me a huge breadth of experience that I could apply to my work. And I recognized at the time that that's what really motivated me. And so the cases were just a component of it, and each case had its own story. But for me, I recognized early that my station in life was as a mentor, as a teacher, as somebody that could bring into each and every case some of this understanding and whatever wisdom I was able to generate over the years into each case. And so I've written a couple books about it. I've written articles about it. But the reality is this incredible opportunity to teach has been able to infiltrate my cases. And, as a mentor, I'm very proud of the people that I've been able to work with, mainly through Pepperdine. Early on, I've had, many students come to the office and observe and get internships. And, I've maintained relationships with all the students over the years. I've had a mentor for 15, 16 years, a mentee that is, and I'm very proud of those experiences and watching them, take flight and succeed in the field. And so as I look at, what's been rewarding for me, it's that extreme ability to have access to other great minds and wisdom and apply it to my work virtually on a daily basis. And so every day is different. And, when I meet up with somebody on a case, I'm a witness to their story. I, I, I get to see the inside and the outside, and I get to help them navigate it in various ways. And, this idea of wisdom is really important to me. It's not just book knowledge. It's kind of having a moral compass. And I think the parties are looking for it because, they walk into these things with this us versus them attitude. There's this feedback loop. Everything you read on social media, ends up, showing indignities about others. But when they come into the mediation room, we're able to, elevate their status to human beings and take them from, the angst of the conflict they're in, and demonstrate to them that, hey, there's more to it, and follow me, and I'll take you hopefully to, out of this this cycle of anger. And that's been really valuable to me, to be able to de-escalate and show them how to do it. But sometimes, the role that we're in is exhausting, because as a neutral, you're a sponge for that anger, for that feedback loop that they have, and, just working in some of these sexual abuse cases, there's a lot of pent up emotion, as you can imagine. And while they don't intend to direct it toward the mediator ends up absorbing it. And, it does wear on you, and you've got to be physically fit, and you've got to be, on your game every day. And it's difficult. It's much harder to do this kind of work than to do trial work. I mean, when I was doing trials, I got to write the script, I got to prepare the script, and then I would go to court and have just one thing to do. And it was already, the drama was already laid out. In the mediations, you never know what they're going to throw at you. It's like a story, and, you've got to get that story out. And in a play, there's, three main acts. You have the act one where, once upon a time this happened, and then you've got to take them to act two. And then finally, you've got to take them to act three, where there is the punchline and there's an ending. And if you don't take them there, you don't really get that story out. And so the role of a mediator is much more complex in my experience, because you don't know where the story's going, and you've got to improvise. And we can talk about that. That's one of the things that I love about it. That is, you've really got to act swiftly on your feet and recognize there's only so much you can prepare for. Who knew that we'd have a pandemic in the middle of all this, and not be able to have human contact except over a computer? That's caused a lot of changes as well. So getting back to your question, it's been a rewarding experience in all those facets. And I can't put my finger on one particular case, because there's so many.
Wonderful. What a fantastic answer. And I want to just highlight 2 points: lifelong learning that you mentioned. And I love when you said, quote unquote, elevate the people, elevate the status to human beings instead of litigants, instead of fighters. And beautiful, sir. Okay, keep going. You mentioned sexual harassment. You mentioned those cases that you've been handling lately. And if I'm not wrong, recently you mediated a highly difficult sexual abuse case, and it may have been one of the largest settlements ever mediated on earth. Tell us what you can about how difficult, or different rather, emotional cases are from pure commercial cases. And if you anything about your approach for such cases that can be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I've been fortunate enough to be selected for probably one of the largest sexual abuse cases in the US. And it was one of those challenges that never, comes across your desk maybe, once every 20 years. And I was pretty busy, didn't really have the time for it, but I chose to do it because, when you're in this field, you want the challenge, you want to see if it can be done. And, like so many athletes, they want to play in the World Series. They want to golf in the Masters. I was listening to Duke Ellington last night, and I was listening to the A Train, and you hear him tease out a little bit of the melody at the beginning, and then he plays it again, and then as you start digging deeper into the song, he starts going into various other variations of the melody, and by the time the song is 6 minutes in, you hardly recognize the melody because he's taken it in so many different directions. And getting into a case of this magnitude allowed me to look at it and go, what direction can I take it? I know I can do the melody. I know I can do the usual formula. I, can I make it more dynamic? Can I play it like Duke Ellington? And so, yeah, it presented both emotional challenges and commercial challenges. It wasn't limited to either. And I can tell you this for a fact, every case has both emotional and commercial challenges. Even if you're dealing with a routine car crash or, something that, you just expect some insurance company to pay some money, there is an emotional component all the way around, whether it's, the person that was hurt or even the insurance decision maker who's got constituents above them that they've got to report to. And you're putting them in an awkward position by asking them to stretch their limits. But in a case like this, I was a witness, and I got to hear the stories of hundreds of people that were victims of some bad acts. But I also got to hear both sides from the inside out, and was able to evaluate, assess it, have my inner thoughts and my outer thoughts about it, and had to be careful on what could be revealed and what couldn't be revealed. But the thing that I noticed about these kinds of cases is, there's a component, particularly from the decision-making side, that categorizes cases, that categorizes the emotional side, because they have to. Because if you're going to be investing money in a settlement, whether you're a corporation, insurance company, or whatever entity that's going to be investing, you've got to be able to objectively assess it. And so they categorize these victims, and then they quantify it. And that's the right way to do it. That's the way it's done actuarially and in a risk-taking environment. The problem is, on the other side of the narrative, they don't want to be categorized because each individual victim has a unique story to tell. And,
Yep.
it may be that, somebody's experience with the bad actor may look on paper to be very modest. Maybe they had just a minor touching, but that person may have had a, prior abuse as a child that has been exacerbated. And just the thought of having contact with the bad actor creates a much bigger dynamic. And so what I try to do in an emotional case like that, which has gigantic commercial overtones, is elevate them from just a folder, just a name, just a number in an insurance directory or a corporate file, and humanize the person. And that was the big challenge when you try to interact the emotional side with the commercial side, because they have to at some point come together with some sense of urgency. And though we do learn in communication class, how to listen and how to understand, and that's so important, this is not therapy. And so you've got to figure out a way to manage it, to bring them both together at the same time, the financial component and the emotional component. And if either side feels that they haven't been heard, we're going to lose them, and we're not going to be able to make a deal. And so the timing is critical. I always tell a story, like when my daughter was 11 years old, she always knew when was the right time to ask for a raise in her allowance. She didn't ask me for another dollar when I got home late at night and I was completely exhausted and stressed out. She'd wait until we slept in on a Sunday morning and, the dogs were laying in bed and the coffee was brewing and the bagels were out. And she knew that I was much more relaxed and ready to do business with her. And that's what happens in an emotional and commercial dispute when you bring it together. You've got to make sure that the timing is right. And what I would do in a case like that would sort of map out what I thought would be the blueprint that I might follow, which, by the way, never works. But you still have to prepare by mapping it out and figuring out what the tipping points might be. And so that's what happened in that case.
This was so helpful. I really appreciate you sharing, Mr. Krivis. Let's keep speaking about emotional cases for one more minute and go into how do you prepare? How do you mentally prepare? I know you discussed physical fitness earlier. As a mediator, you mentioned you take in a lot of emotion, so you have to be physically fit. But any thoughts or comments about how to prepare for such a case?
Yeah, each case is different, but you've got to be like an investigator. Remember the old television show Columbo? You've got to kind of look for clues, and I do that. Whether it's Google search, in the case that we were just talking about. I had no idea of the history of it. I didn't pay attention to it when it was in the papers, and I learned about it literally, the day they called me. And there was a lot written about it. There was some investigative journalism on it, and so the first thing I would do would be to read some of the reporting on the background, just kind of get the narrative, and then spend some time doing pre-mediation calls with key decision makers, key players, and not for the purpose of cross-examining, but just listening, just finding out, what the highlights are, what the tipping points are that they're mentioning, and just absorb it and allow it to just kind of sink in from all angles and not be judgmental on anything. Because you can imagine, like any pancake that's thinly poured, there's always two sides. And so with that recognition, I let it all come in. I do the fact finding. I just kind of absorb as much as possible. And then I do most of my really creative thinking when I just get away from the dispute. And I might, go on a hike or go to the beach or do something that's totally unrelated to law and mediation and work. And you've got to let your mind free up. And that's when you start kind of understanding a little bit. So in preparing for a case like this, I try to give myself space to do nothing, actually. And when I get to that space, then I'm able to kind of redirect it and see the full vision of the playing field. And it's kind of like, you've heard the old famous quote about Wayne Gretzky, he skates to where the puck is going, not where it's been. Or, I remember, the Lakers in the 1980s with Magic Johnson, you could see, he'd be dribbling down the field, but he also knew where his players were behind him and in front of him. And you have to kind of be like that and have that approach where you're seeing the whole field. And that's what I would do in preparing. Briefly talking about the physical side of it, and particularly during the pandemic, it's been pretty rough. I used to, have a private trainer 3 days a week, and I've been pretty lazy after it's been over a year now in this pandemic zone. But you've got to give yourself the room to keep physically fit and mentally fit. You've got to eat right. I became, a smoothie expert during the pandemic because it was light enough to not fill me up and allowed me to, do my work, but also gave me enough calories to keep going. And so physically is probably the most important thing. And so I do focus a lot on, doing some walking, I've got a Peloton. I make sure that, I eat right, and that's critical. You can't just throw things in your body and expect to be performing at a top level. So there's a lot that goes on in preparation. But the biggest thing intellectually is trying to identify the patterns of behavior that might get in the way, that might impede progress. And having done so many of these cases, I'm looking for those tipping points. And I'm looking for them at, the 30,000 foot view, as somebody who hasn't been invested in the case, who can see, the globe easily. And then I drill down slowly until I can, map that out and then try to navigate where it's going. And I'm basically planning it out so that I can take the parties with me through the scenes of the play that we have to get through. In a case of this magnitude, the best laid plans were simply not the way it went, because when we're doing a big case like this, you really want to have an opportunity to have an in-person communication, build rapport, build trust, build the goodwill, which is my stock in trade, and really socialize people to the process and each other. And that was my big plan on some of these big cases. But due to the pandemic, we were never able to meet in person. Every time we were trying to organize something, there was another outbreak of COVID. And so it completely shifted any plan that I had to move forward in virtually many of the cases I've done over the last year. But the bigger ones were heavily impacted. And so I had to improvise. I had to make things up as I went along. And, the biggest regret from the last year is not being able to break bread with certain people. Like in this big case we were just talking about, I didn't know any of the lawyers. And so it takes a while to connect with people in a human way and for them to build trust. And if I could have it over again, I just want even short periods of time together in a room where we could at least connect with each other, even in an informal way. But to do it over a computer, while I think there's some incredible value and productivity that we've gotten out of using Zoom and this technology, it doesn't beat the in-person experience. And that was the biggest impediment that I found in the last year of working in this environment. And so I've had to really shift my goals on cases to adapt to the environment. Now, the good news is about all of this is, Zoom is a transportation system. And so it's really interrupted airplanes and trains and cars, and people aren't driving on the freeways anymore. And it's forced us to be able to communicate in a completely different way and in an efficient, quick way. And so what I've been able to do is not just set up a mediation for a day and we have, that's the day. I've been able to create incremental mediations. So I've been able to do, quick and dirty Zoom calls on these big cases that maybe it lasts 20 minutes or 45 minutes, but you get things done. And they're not designed to just simply, schmooze and tell war stories. Every call is designed to create movement in a case. And that sense of urgency helped move the needle in these kinds of cases, because you wouldn't have a conference on Zoom without a goal. What are we trying to achieve? Either it's an understanding of what just happened, or it's, what are you going to offer to move forward in this negotiation? Or what are we going to do with the structure of the rest of this mediation? So the opportunity to work in this environment actually opened up a lot of doors as well. So it's good and bad, but we've all had to adapt, and I've had to adapt in a huge way to reconfigure what I was going to do, and it worked out. But I have some, regrets that I quite a few, people involved that I couldn't build the kind of real connections that I normally build. But I tried to keep my eye on the ball, and thankfully we had, God, some of the greatest lawyers I've ever worked with, and just human beings. Just, without people committed to the process and showing a willingness to try to find a solution, it's not gonna. I don't care if you're the mediator from God, it's not going to work. And in a case like this, even though, we had, very, very challenging legal issues, and, really great trial lawyers, they all had one goal, and that was, how do we solve this problem for everybody? And Mr. Mediator, help us find a way.
Wonderful.
And that was really invigorating. And then finally, I did something I've never done before during this pandemic. I actually had two experiences where I co-mediated, and I'm not good at that. I'm a control freak. But I had one early on in the pandemic in a class action setting, where I literally did the case the day the pandemic was announced and the stock market crashed, and we had to stop short, and we couldn't finish the case. Everybody had to fly back to their homes and shelter in place. And so a few months later, we were going to reconvene the case, and there were lawyers on the East Coast that didn't know me, and new firms that got involved, and they wanted to bring in another mediator. And I said, fine, but the other mediator knew nothing about the area of law. And the key party said, no, I don't want to bring in another mediator. What do you think? I said, well, why don't we just work together? And so I worked with another JAMS mediator who was spectacular. And we just kind of played off each other. He didn't know the law, I knew the law, but he knew the players. And when we got to make a deal, I relied on him to navigate his constituency to help close the deal. And the same thing happened in the sexual abuse type cases. I was fortunate enough to work with the former presiding judge of the LA Superior Court. And, I'd never done that before, where, the judge is overseeing a case, and, was that important. And the judge was just so supportive of the process and the efforts, and making himself available 24/7. These folks that are sitting on the bench, they're not sitting there because by accident. They are the best of the best, and particularly the complex department in LA. This is their life, and solving problems is what they live for. And I thought that really, I wasn't sure how it was going to work, but I was open to it to see how we'd navigate it. And then I realized, wow, this is really an asset to the case, because in the end, a case like, a big case usually requires some kind of a recommendation from the mediator that everybody has to start thinking about. And having a recommendation that's endorsed by, a judge of this magnitude is gold, and just so valuable to a mediator. I'm not sure lawyers in a case, that's got, significant value like this would just listen to any mediator. And it could be, the best mediator in the world. They're still going to say, well, they're just trying to make a deal. Is it very real? But when you have the imprimatur of the presiding judge, it really gives people some cover and protection when they go back to their decision makers. And so I learned a lot from that experience, and so appreciate the court involvement. Again, after 40 years, it's the first time I've ever done that. And uh, I'd be open to it in the future.
Well, just to clarify, Mr. Krivis, you did the entire mediation, the large sexual abuse case we were discussing, online, remotely.
The whole thing was done through Zoom and phone and emails and cell calls. That was not the intent. Many times tried to set up in-person meetings. We would clean the conference rooms and, get the masks out and everything. But really, in the end, there were, quite a few people, that did not want to be exposed to the pandemic. And we had a couple of surges that made it really, physically challenging.
Mhm.
And so we never did it, yet we had to figure out a way to move forward. And so there were depositions, there were summaries, everybody kind of knew the stories. And instead of bringing, a dozen victims in person to tell the stories, we used other mechanisms to tell the stories, and it worked. It wasn't an ideal approach. It's not what we teach in mediation school. But you know what? These are the cards that we were dealt. And thankfully, the lawyers were willing to adapt. And at some point, the biggest shift, I think, that allowed us to, really concentrate was, there's a couple things. One, cases set for trial always kind of move the decision makers. And it was hard to try a case during the pandemic, but they were going to set, maybe a bellwether case to get a sense of it. And so there were lots of, decisions to make in litigation. And I asked the lawyers to stop the litigation and to do a pause on all of it for a couple of weeks so that all of their attention could be based on the settlement efforts.
Mhm.
Because while we're going down two paths, both the settlement path and the litigation path, it's a tug, and the litigation path usually has more power than the settlement path because there's time constraints, there's the court overseeing it, you've got to get things done, there's motions to get evidence in. And so it's hard for lawyers who are hard charging, who want to get their case set for trial, to just stop. And I just give these lawyers so much credit for recognizing that we did need a pause. We did need to kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, we can hard charge all the way, but if we're ever going to solve this problem, we need a moment to focus. And they did, and they allowed us the time to do the socialization, to work with the various bureaucratic entities and constituents. And this is, these kinds of cases, it's not just an across the table bargaining situation. There are layers of challenges and layers of people and decision makers that go into it that, even now I don't fully comprehend. But it's our job as the neutral to try to understand it and try to make sure that they have a voice and that they're heard, and that we figure out how to navigate it so that we can prop it up and let them make an informed decision. And so that's what we did, and gave them a limited time to make those decisions, and thankfully they did. And I'm very proud of the people that were involved. They, the passion of these lawyers on behalf of their victims, and the technical expertise that they brought to the table was profound. I've rarely seen it in my entire career. And, the restorative justice component that was part of the whole settlement was, having now seen what was written in the papers, and they hardly touched on that, but that was a huge component that I thought that the parties worked on. And I was very proud of what they did and what changes they've made to the system on a very serious ongoing basis. I just think um, you had people invested in doing the right thing. And then in the end, how great that, these victims could have closure, and know they could look back, and justice was served and the system worked, which, I had my doubts for a while. Would the system work? The system worked beautifully. And it was quite inspiring. So yeah.
Thank you.
I was,
I love the point that you underlined, that the attorneys were super helpful and they were collaborative, and that really helped you. And thank you for sharing everything you shared. I know we have limited time. I want to ask you at least one more question, and that is, you have taught negotiation. You have taught how to negotiate in mediation. Would you comment on, and I know you mentioned flexibility, improvisation, and using multiple tactics, techniques, preparations in a case like this. Would you comment on what negotiations were successful? Any techniques you used, any tools you used within a case like this, if you may?
Obviously there's a protective order, and I'm not going to talk about the substance of any negotiations, but I can just identify a couple things. One, I think you've got to be able to identify the leverage points and know what would be used by either side, and recognize it, and not deny it. In the concept that I used to teach at Pepperdine of improvisation, we would teach how improvisational actors would accept the information from the other side, not necessarily agree on everything, but we had a concept called yes and, where I would not deny the dialogue. I would keep the scene moving forward. And I think that was that's very key. And then just kind of getting down to basics, and, getting down to, like, the first book anybody's ever read on negotiation was Getting to Yes. And they say, focus on interests. And, sometimes we forget about that, but that is still the foundation of what we do. And try to depersonalize it. Don't attack the human being, attack the issue, but try to understand the interests. And, the interests are so varied in a case like this. You've got many different participants with, different goals and objectives and turfs that they're on. And they all have to be recognized and brought to a point of no return at the same time. It's almost like, we've got a bunch of ships, that's coming into the harbor, and they all have to park at the same time, and we have to create that timing. And so those are a couple of issues: identifying patterns of negotiation that I've seen before and recognizing those patterns, and making sure that I didn't stumble over some of those patterns, because, lawyers tend to repeat the way they've negotiated in other cases, and it may not be successful in other cases. But if I was to deny that approach, then I might lose their attention. So I've got to let them in and then guide them to a different approach. But kind of a major thing that I do in negotiations that I'm constantly aware of is this idea of, do I want to be transparent or not transparent? And there's articles written about this from Harvard from 30 years ago. It's when I first started becoming aware of it. And when I talk about transparency, I have to say that tends to be my style. I tend to be candid and open about what I'm doing. And I'm telling people what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it, and how that might have an impact on the negotiation and the overall mediation. Now, there are other mediators who have a non-transparent style, where they basically carry the water across the table, and that is very effective. And then the other side has to react to that offer or counter offer, but they don't tell them why it is, what's behind it. And sometimes I'll even do that. And, if you remember the old risk and grid, we had, the judge approach, where they're just basically telling the other side, I've been doing this for 30 years and this is what you need to do. okay, that's one approach. But stylistically, I tend to be transparent because, first of all, I'm a truthful person, and I think you've got to maintain your ability to be truthful with the parties. And if you're non-transparent, there's a sense of, is that neutral deceiving me? Can I trust that neutral? Once I've lost the trust of the parties, I'm not able to gain it back. And so I usually err on the side of being transparent. And I think it's disarming for a lot of people because uh, the process that we're in is a confidential process. And in that process, people sometimes take liberties to not necessarily tell the truth because they can get away with it. Whereas when you're in court, if you're at a mandatory settlement conference with a judge in court, and you've sworn to tell the truth under the penalty of perjury, there's penalties for lying. And so what I try to do, utilizing this concept of transparency in the negotiation, is give them a sense of direction, of leadership, and showing them where the minefields are and telling them why I'm doing something and what the potential outcome might be. And so they could see where we're going. And if we don't get there, I might tell them, we can't get there because there's still this impediment and that impediment, but I think here's a way around it. And so those are the strategies that are the basic ones. Now, we can get into negotiation all day long, but those are the overarching themes that I normally see.
That's brilliant. So my last question, and I know very briefly, what inspires you to continue to mediate difficult cases? Because I know we all know you're very successful. You don't have to do this every day, but why are you doing it?
I may be a glutton for punishment, but like any athlete or anybody who's been in a profession and has been working their hearts out to be the best that they could be, the challenge of something that you haven't done before is invigorating for me. And I'll just say, when I first started doing workshops with Randy Lowry and Peter Robinson, I was completely intimidated by their talents. And I'd come home at the end of the day after doing a training for the Superior Court judges or whatever, and I'd say to my wife, I could never do what they do. They are so good. And then over time, I improved by just repeated practice and just challenging and pushing myself to where then I was able to do it on my own. And there's various areas that I've always found that if I can't push forward and try something new, I lose interest. And so maybe the reason why I've done so many areas of law over the years is because after a while, I kind of get used to a certain thing, and I just, I don't want to land the plane. I want to try to find something else to fly to and do. So, I've been just blessed to have so many unique cases over the years. And the challenge of just pushing myself, I always find that even though I get butterflies and it's difficult, I usually get through it, and I'm a better person and I'm better at what I do after the experience, no matter how much pain it might cause. And I think the key is, being unafraid of failure. And I have made many mistakes, and I continue to make mistakes. And I've settled a lot of cases, and I've failed at a lot of cases. But that all goes into the mix of the overall success. Because if you haven't failed, you haven't been in the arena. You haven't really, tested it out. And so, my belief is just go for it and be the best you can be. And I know those are trite words, but I found that it's really elevated me way beyond what I was as a trial lawyer. I don't have the limitations I had 30 years ago. I've been able to really expand my universe in so many ways that I couldn't have envisioned as a young lawyer. And so that's why I go for it.
I on behalf of the Strauss Institute, I'm just so pleased, Mr. Krivis, for your time to us, and what wonderful wisdom you shared with us. And I'm so delighted that you are continuing to be a mentor to young minds, young mediators, young attorneys, and not so young. So on behalf of our institute, I will be mailing you, since this is a pandemic, we should have been in person, a painting of our campus by Professor Tom Stepanovich, one of your colleagues. And so please accept this on our behalf. And thank you for giving us your time today. Thank you so much.
I would not insult you by saying no. Thank you, Professor Singh, and thank you for what you do for the university.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.